before the legions marched at his command, before the crown was offered and refused, and before the sharp betrayal that echoed through eternity, there was simply the city. Rome lay beneath an indifferent Italian sky, a sprawling tapestry of sun-baked brick and rising marble, where ancient bloodlines carried the crushing weight of destiny. In the shadowed halls of a proud but fading house, a young boy grew up watching the great republic tremble on its foundations. He was heir to a name older than the city itself, a lineage tracing back to the goddess Venus, yet he walked streets where ambition was the most dangerous fire a soul could hold. This is not the story of a god, but of the boy who would force the world to remake itself in his image. The Rome of Gaius Julius Caesar's youth was a city defined by stark contrasts, a place where the blinding Mediterranean light cast long, deep shadows. It was not yet the monolithic empire of white stone that later generations would imagine. Instead, it was a chaotic, organic entity, growing outward from the seven hills, a maze of narrow alleys in the Subura districts bustling with a million silent lives, juxtaposed against the serene, elevated villas of the Palatine where the air felt thinner and cooler. The scent of the city was a complex layering of dust from the unpaved roads, the metallic tang of the Tiber River flowing sluggishly toward the sea, the smoke of countless cooking fires, and the faint, ever-present aroma of incense burning on altars dedicated to gods who watched silently over the sprawling metropolis. For a young patrician born into the ancient gens Julia, life was governed by invisible yet unbreakable threads of tradition and expectation. The Julii were of the highest nobility, their ancestry woven into the very myths of Rome's founding. They claimed direct descent from Iulus, the son of the Trojan prince Aeneas, and through him from the goddess Venus herself. Yet, by the time of Caesar's birth in the year 100 BCE, this illustrious heritage was not matched by immense wealth or immediate political power. The family lived in the Subura, a dense and somewhat disreputable quarter, though their own dwelling retained the dignified, severe architecture of old Roman morality. The atrium of his childhood home was a quiet space, centered around the impluvium, a shallow pool that caught the rainwater from the opening in the roof above. The stone floors were cool beneath bare feet, and the walls, adorned with the stern, wax death masks of his ancestors, served as a constant, silent reminder of the standards he was expected to meet. These ancestors watched him with painted eyes, their achievements a silent burden on the shoulders of the young Gaius. His education was typical for a boy of his station, yet intense in its focus. It was a rigorous shaping of the mind, designed to produce not just a scholar, but a weapon of the state. In quiet rooms, away from the heat of the midday sun, he sat with tutors, often highly educated Greeks enslaved by Roman conquest. They opened scrolls of papyrus that smelled of dried reeds and aged ink, teaching him the intricate cadences of Homeric verse and the complex philosophical arguments of Athens. He learned to read both Latin and Greek with fluency, absorbing the histories of great men, of Alexander and Cyrus, measuring his own forming identity against their towering legacies. Rhetoric, the art of persuasion, was paramount. A Roman aristocrat's power lay not just in his sword arm, but in his ability to sway the Senate and control the mob in the forum with nothing but words. Young Caesar practiced the art of gesture, the modulation of voice, learning how to construct sentences that stood solid and imposing like Roman architecture. Physically, he was noted even then for a certain intensity. He was tall, fair-skinned, with dark, piercing eyes that seemed to constantly assess the world around him. He was fastidious about his appearance, a trait some considered effeminate in a society that prized rugged austerity. He wore his tunics loosely belted, a subtle affectation of style that drew the eye, a small rebellion against rigid norms. Yet beneath the carefully draped folds of his toga, there was a wiry strength and a constitution that, while sometimes frail, possessed immense reserves of nervous energy. He was a skilled horseman from a young age, learning to control powerful beasts with subtle shifts of weight and firm hands, a physical manifestation of the control he sought over his own destiny. The political atmosphere outside the cool confines of his home was toxic and volatile. Rome was tearing itself apart in a series of internal conflicts known as the social wars, followed by brutal civil strifes between powerful generals. The Republic, designed to prevent any one man from holding too much power, was buckling under the weight of its own immense conquests. Two gigantic figures dominated the landscape of Caesar's youth: Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Marius, a novice homo or new man who had risen through military genius rather than aristocratic birth, was a hero to the common people and, crucially, Julia's uncle by marriage. This connection placed the young Caesar firmly in the Marian camp, a dangerous alignment in shifting times. Marius had reformed the army, creating professional legions loyal to their general rather than the abstract concept of the state. This terrified the traditional aristocracy, the optimates, who found their champion in Sulla. Sulla was a patrician of the old school, ruthless, brilliant, and determined to restore the absolute authority of the Senate, by force if necessary. The tension between these factions was palpable in the very air of the forum. It hung heavy like the humidity before a summer thunderstorm. Young Caesar walked through these spaces, observing the shifting alliances, the way men greeted each other with guarded eyes, the subtle exclusions and embraces that marked political favor. He learned early that power in Rome was a fluid thing, not solid like the statues of the gods, but treacherous like the Tiber in flood. The storm broke when Sulla marched on Rome, seizing control and instituting a reign of terror to purge his enemies. Marius was dead, but his followers were hunted. Sulla posted proscription lists in the Forum daily, tablets bearing the names of those declared enemies of the state. To read one's name on the white tablet was a death sentence. Their property was forfeit, their lives offered to anyone who would take them. The city held its breath. The silence in the streets was heavier than usual, broken by the hurried footsteps of those fleeing or the grim march of Sulla's soldiers executing his will. In this atmosphere of supreme danger, the teenage Caesar, barely 18, found himself in the dictator's crosshairs. Sulla, looking at the young man, saw something that unsettled him. He famously remarked to his inner circle that he saw many Mariuses in the young Caesar. The connection was too strong to ignore. Sulla ordered Caesar to divorce his wife, Cornelia. Cornelia was the daughter of Cinna, Marius's crucial ally. The marriage was a potent political symbol of the defeated faction. To obey Sulla was the only rational choice. Grown men, seasoned senators, and powerful generals quaked before the dictator's wrath and did as they were told to save their lives and fortunes. Yet, the young Caesar, with a stubbornness that would define his entire existence, refused. It was an act of breathtaking arrogance and suicidal bravery. He would not cast aside his wife at the command of a tyrant. He stood in the atrium of his ancestors, surrounded by the silent wax masks, and made a choice that valued personal honor and perhaps a calculated defiance over immediate safety. The refusal brought swift retribution. Caesar was stripped of his priesthood, his wife's dowry was confiscated, and his own meager inheritance was seized. He was declared an enemy. The comfortable, predictable life of a Roman patrician evaporated overnight. The city of his birth, the only world he had ever truly known, had become a hunting ground, and he was the prey. He was forced to flee Rome in the dead of night. He slipped away from the familiar streets of the Subura, leaving behind the stone and order of the city for the uncertain darkness of the Italian countryside. He became a fugitive, moving constantly, hiding in the villas of sympathetic friends, sleeping in rough shelters in the hills, always looking over his shoulder. He suffered from bouts of sickness, the quartan fever racking his body as he evaded Sulla's bounty hunters. There were close calls, moments where the sheen of a soldier's breastplate in the moonlight or the sound of approaching horses forced him deeper into the shadows. He had to use every ounce of his wit and charm, sometimes bribing his captors with money he barely had, using the force of his personality to survive another day. This period of exile was the crucible that forged the man. Stripped of his wealth, his status, and the protection of his city, he learned self-reliance in its most brutal form. The soft, scholarly boy who smelled of papyrus and incense was replaced by a wary, hardened young man who understood that in the great game of Rome, one must be either the hammer or the anvil. He traveled south, towards the sea, looking away from the 7 hills and towards the wider Mediterranean world. The Republic had cast him out, but in doing so, it had unwittingly set him on a path that would lead him back to its heart, not as a supplicant, but as its master. The long, difficult road to absolute power had begun in the darkness of escape. The Italian peninsula faded into a thin, hazy line of gray on the horizon, swallowed by the immense, breathing expanse of the Mediterranean. For Gaius Julius Caesar, leaving Rome was not merely a departure from a physical location. It was a severance from the only stage upon which his life made sense. The sea, known to the Romans as Mare Nostrum, our sea, was a vast, unpredictable wilderness of shifting blues and greens, a liquid desert that connected empires yet isolated souls. As the ship cut through the gentle swell, the wooden hull groaning rhythmically against the pressure of the water, the young patrician stood at the rail, watching the foam curl and dissolve. He was no longer the hunted fugitive in the hills of Italy. He was now a traveler, a student of the world, seeking the polish and steel that only the ancient centers of learning could provide. His destination was Rhodes, an island renowned not for its military might, but for its schools of rhetoric, where the art of speech was refined into a tool sharper than any gladius. The journey was intended to be a pilgrimage of the mind. He sought Apollonius Molon, the illustrious teacher who had trained Cicero, to temper his own oratory style. However, the Mediterranean in this era was not a safe Roman lake. It was infested with Cilician pirates, bands of marauders who knew the hidden coves and currents better than any naval captain. Somewhere off the coast of Pharmacusa, the calm voyage was interrupted. It was not a battle of epic proportions, but a sudden, overwhelming encirclement. The pirate vessels, swift and predatory, swarmed the merchant ship. There was no chaos of war, only the swift, efficient transaction of capture. Caesar, along with his traveling companions, was taken. For 38 days, the rhythm of his life shifted from the structured ambition of Rome to the sun-drenched, suspended reality of a pirate stronghold. He was a prisoner, yet his demeanor refused to accept the status of a captive. The island was a place of stark, natural beauty, where the harsh sunlight bleached the rocks white and the scrub brush clung tenaciously to the cliffs. The air smelled of salt, dried fish, and the resin of pine trees baking in the heat. Caesar moved through this environment with a terrifying, quiet confidence. He did not cower in a cell. He walked among his captors, observing them with the detached curiosity of a naturalist studying a pack of wolves. When the pirates, ignorant of the true value of the man they held, set his ransom at 20 talents of silver, Caesar laughed. It was a silent, internal amusement at their lack of vision. He insisted they ask for 50. It was a moment of supreme arrogance, but also a calculation of his own worth in the currency of the world. While his associates were sent away to the cities of Asia Minor to raise the immense sum, Caesar remained behind with a physician and 2 servants. The days stretched out, long and languid. He joined the pirates in their exercises, running and jumping on the sandy shores, yet he kept an invisible wall of superiority between them. He wrote poems and speeches in the shade of the olive trees, the parchment crinkling in the dry heat. When he read his works to the pirates and they failed to appreciate the nuances of his Latin or Greek phrasing, he called them illiterate barbarians to their faces. They laughed, thinking it the jest of an eccentric prisoner, failing to see the icy seriousness behind his eyes. He would sleep when he chose, sending orders for them to be silent so as not to disturb his rest. In this strange, liminal space, he was practicing the authority he would one day wield over nations. He told them, calmly and without malice, that once he was free, he would return and crucify them all. They took it as a joke, a story to tell around the fire while the wine flowed. The ransom arrived. The silver was weighed, the transaction completed, and Caesar was released on the coast of Miletus. The pirates sailed away, richer and content, vanishing into the labyrinth of the Aegean Islands. For any other man, this would have been the end of the ordeal, a story of survival to recount in old age. For Caesar, it was merely the completion of a contract. He did not flee to safety. He immediately went to the harbor, commandeered ships, raised a small fleet on his own authority, though he held no official command, and turned the prows back toward Pharmacusa. The return was swift. The pirates were found exactly where he knew they would be, anchored and celebrating their windfall. The surprise was total. There was no glory in the capture, only the cold, mechanical application of justice. He took back the 50 talents, seized their plunder, and took the pirates themselves as prisoners. He brought them to Pergamum. When the local Roman governor hesitated to execute them, debating the legalities and eyeing the wealth they possessed, Caesar did not wait for bureaucratic permission. He had given his word. He returned to the prison and ordered their execution himself. He had them crucified as he had promised, though in a final act of lenient mercy, he ordered their throats cut first to end their suffering quickly. It was a grim, silent lesson in the nature of his character. His word was iron, and his memory was long. With the debt paid and the balance of his honor restored, he resumed his journey to Rhodes. The island rose from the sea like a monument to intellect. The harbor, once guarded by the Colossus, was a bustle of cosmopolitan trade, but the schools were quiet sanctuaries of thought. Here, the streets were paved with history, and the air hummed with philosophical debate. Under the tutelage of Apollonius, Caesar stripped away the high-pitched, energetic style of his youth. He learned control. He learned to modulate his voice, to use silence as effectively as sound, to structure his arguments with the precision of a military campaign. He wandered the stone colonnades of Rhodes, looking out at the sea that had tried to claim him. He was no longer just a survivor of Sulla's purges. He was a man who had faced death, captivity, and the vast indifference of the world, and had imposed his will upon it. The sea was vast, but his ambition was beginning to outgrow even the horizon. He studied the statues of the gods and the heroes, the way they stood frozen in moments of perfect tension. He was sculpting himself, chipping away the fear, the hesitation, the softness, leaving only the hard, polished marble of a leader. The time in the east, across the sea, was not an intermission. It was the dress rehearsal for the empire he would one day hold in the palm of his hand. Rome, upon Caesar's return, was a city exhaling after a long period of holding its breath. The tyrant Sulla was dead, his body consumed by the worms of his own decay, and the terrible prescriptions had officially ended. Yet, the scars on the Republic remained deep and tender. The city that Gaius Julius Caesar stepped back into was a cauldron of simmering ambition, a place where the old rules were fraying and new, unspoken rules were being forged in the shadows of the Senate House. He returned not as a conqueror, for he had no legions yet, but as a man possessed of a singular, burning clarity. He understood that in Rome power was not given. It was seized, bought, or seduced. The path to the top, the cursus honorum, was a steep, slippery ladder that had thrown many good men into the abyss of obscurity. Caesar looked up at its dizzying heights and began to climb, rung by treacherous rung. He began in the Forum, the beating heart of the empire. This was not a place of quiet contemplation but a chaotic, dusty arena of law and commerce. Here, the air was thick with the voices of lawyers, the cries of merchants, and the murmur of the mob. Caesar, still young and relatively unknown, established himself as an advocate. He did not choose easy cases. He went after the corrupt, the powerful former governors who had bled the provinces dry. He prosecuted them with a ferocity and eloquence that startled the establishment. His voice, trained in the calm schools of Rhodes, now rang out against the stone pillars of the rostra, cutting through the noise of the city like a finely honed blade. He stood tall, his toga arranged in that distinctive, loose fashion, his gestures precise and commanding. Even when he lost cases, for the judges were often bribed by the wealthy defendants, he won something far more valuable: the attention of the people. They saw in him a champion, a patrician who was not afraid to tear into his own class. But eloquence alone could not pave the road to dominance. Rome was a beast that demanded to be fed, entertained, and dazzled. To rise, one needed money, rivers of it. Caesar, whose family fortune had been stripped away, had none. This did not stop him. It merely changed his strategy. He began to borrow. He borrowed on a scale that was breathtaking in its recklessness. He took gold from anyone who would lend it, leveraging his name, his future prospects, and his sheer charisma against mountains of debt. He understood a fundamental economic truth of his era. If you owe a man 1,000 sestertii, you are his servant. If you owe him 1,000,000, he is your partner, desperate for your success so that he might be repaid. Caesar turned his creditors into his greatest supporters. His first official step on the ladder was the quaestorship, which took him far from the intrigues of the capital to the rugged, sun-beaten landscapes of Hispania. It was a provincial posting, administrative and dull by nature, involving the auditing of accounts and the settling of local disputes. Yet, it was here, in the quiet heat of the Iberian Peninsula, that the fire within him threatened to consume him. The story is told of his visit to the city of Gades. There, in the Temple of Hercules, stood a statue of Alexander the Great. Caesar, now in his early 30s, stood before the marble likeness of the Macedonian king. He stared at the face of the man who, by Caesar's age, had conquered the known world. From the shores of Greece to the banks of the Indus, Caesar looked at the silent stone conqueror and then looked inward at his own life. He had achieved nothing. No empires toppled, no new maps drawn, merely a few legal victories and a pile of debts. He wept. It was not a weeping of despair, but of a furious impatience. He requested his recall to Rome immediately. The provinces were too small a stage. Back in the capital, he aimed for the aedileship, the office responsible for the maintenance of public buildings and, crucially, the regulation of public festivals. This was the position where a man could buy the love of the mob, and Caesar bought it with a lavishness that bordered on madness. He staged games that Rome had never seen before. The spectacle was overwhelming. He flooded the arenas with wild beasts from Africa, lions and panthers that prowled the sands, their roars echoing off the marble seats. He commissioned gladiators, not just a handful but hundreds, equipping them not in dull iron, but in silver armor that flashed blindingly in the sun. The people were intoxicated. They whispered his name in the taverns and the bathhouses. He was no longer just a lawyer. He was Caesar, the man who brought the wonders of the world to their doorstep. He restored the trophies of his uncle Marius, the great general whose name Sulla had tried to erase. One morning, the people awoke to find the glittering statues of Marius and his victories against the barbarians restored to their places of honor on the Capitol. The optimates, the conservative elites, ground their teeth in anger, seeing the ghost of their old enemy rising, but the people wept with joy. Caesar was weaving his own legend into the fabric of their nostalgia. This extravagance came at a terrible price. His debts were now astronomical. He walked a razor's edge between total ruin and absolute power. His enemies in the Senate watched him with the predatory patience of vultures, waiting for him to slip. They knew he was bankrupt. They knew he was desperate. But Caesar was a gambler who played with the nerves of a statue. He forged a secret, unholy alliance, the triumvirate. He brought together two men who hated each other. Pompey the Great, the most celebrated general of the age, a man who had expanded the borders of the empire and cleared the seas of pirates, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, a real estate mogul who owned half the city and whose gold could buy armies. Caesar stood between them, the charm that bound Pompey's military might to Crassus's bottomless purse. To seal the pact, he gave his only daughter, Julia, in marriage to Pompey. Was a political masterstroke. With the swords of Pompey and the gold of Crassus backing him, Caesar was untouchable. The culmination of this early ascent was the election for the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of the Roman state religion. It was a lifetime appointment, a position of immense prestige and sanctity, usually reserved for elderly, distinguished statesmen. Caesar, young and scandalous, threw his hat into the ring. The audacity of it left the city breathless. The election was a war fought not with weapons but with bribes. Gold flowed through the streets like water in the aqueducts. On the morning of the election, Caesar walked out of his house in the Subura. His mother, Aurelia, a woman of steel and dignity who had shaped him, kissed him goodbye. He looked at her, his face pale but his eyes burning with that familiar, terrifying resolve. He told her quietly, "Mother, today you will see your son either as the high priest or as an exile." There was no middle ground. Defeat meant financial collapse and flight from his creditors. Victory meant immunity and the sacred protection of the gods. He waited as the tribes voted, the hours stretching out in an agonizing silence. The sun climbed high over the forum, baking the stones, while the fate of the republic turned on the count of wax tablets. When the results were announced, it was a landslide. The people, the mob he had fed and entertained, the citizens he had defended, had carried him to the pinnacle of religious authority. Caesar walked back to his home not as a fugitive, but as the Pontifex Maximus. He moved into the Domus Publica in the Forum, the official residence of the high priest. He was now at the physical and spiritual center of Rome. But the latter went higher. The consulship, the highest political office in the Republic, was the next rung. His year as consul was a storm of activity. He bulldozed through legislation, ignoring the protests of his co-cowl, Bibulus. When Bibulus tried to block a vote by declaring the omens unfavorable, a traditional religious stalling tactic, Caesar's supporters simply dumped a basket of manure over his head and chased him from the forum. Bibulus spent the rest of the year hiding in his house, leaving Caesar as the sole, effective ruler of Rome. Wits in the city joked that the year was not the consulship of Bibulus and Caesar, but of Julius and Caesar. He passed land reform laws that distributed farming plots to the poor and to Pompey's veterans, cementing the loyalty of the soldiers and the proletariat. He forced the Senate to publish its proceedings, bringing transparency to the murky backroom dealings of the aristocracy. Every day was a battle, every speech a skirmish. He slept little, dictating letters to multiple scribes simultaneously, his mind moving faster than their pens could scratch the parchment. He was a force of nature, a wind blowing through the stagnant halls of tradition. As his consulship drew to a close, he knew the danger was returning. Once he stepped down from office, he would lose his legal immunity. His enemies were sharpening their knives, preparing the lawsuits that would destroy him. He needed a new command, a new protection. He looked north towards the Alps. Beyond the mountains lay Gaul, a vast, mysterious land of dark forests, warrior tribes, and untold riches. It was a place of nightmares for the Romans, the home of the barbarians who had once sacked their city centuries ago. To Caesar, it was not a nightmare. It was an opportunity. It was the forge where he would temper his legions and build a power base that no senator could touch. He secured the governorship of Illyricum and Gaul for 5 years. The ladder had been climbed. He stood on the parapet of Roman power. But standing still was not in his nature. He looked north, towards the mist-shrouded trees and the unknown. The politician was about to die, and the warlord was about to be born. The Forum had been conquered. Now, the world awaited. Beyond the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Alps lay a world that existed more in the Roman imagination than on any reliable map. It was a land of ancient, brooding forests where the trees grew so thick they blotted out the sun, of mist-shrouded valleys where rivers ran wild and untamed, and of fierce, independent tribes whose lineage stretched back into the mists of time. This was Gaul. To the civilized citizens of Rome, wrapped in their togas and walking on paved marble, it was the edge of the known world, a place of monsters and barbarism. To Julius Caesar, standing on the precipice of his proconsulship, it was a canvas waiting for the stroke of his sword. He did not enter Gaul merely to defend the borders of the Republic. He entered to swallow it whole. The transition from the sun-drenched Mediterranean to the verdant, damp interior of the continent was a shift in reality itself. The air here was heavier, smelling of wet earth, pine resin, and wood smoke. The legions that marched under Caesar's eagle were not just soldiers. They were a moving city, a machine of conquest engineered to perfection. The rhythmic tramp of hobnailed sandals on the dirt roads was a sound that would come to define the decade. It was a low, steady thrum, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant, echoing through the valleys of the Rhone and the Saône. These men, the legionaries, were the backbone of Caesar's ambition. They carried not just their gladius and pilum, but the tools of civilization: the spade, the pickaxe, and the saw. Every evening, no matter how exhausted they were from the march, they built a fortified camp. It was a ritual of order imposed upon chaos. Ditches were dug, ramparts raised, and tents aligned in perfect grids. In the heart of the wild Gallic wilderness, a piece of Rome was recreated every single night, a testament to discipline that terrified the Gauls as much as the Roman steel. Caesar rode at their head, or often walked amongst them, sharing their bread and their hardships. He was 40 years old now, his hairline receding, his face lined with the stress of years of political warfare, but his energy was boundless. He dictated his famous commentaries while on horseback, his scribes struggling to keep pace with his thoughts. These writings were not just military reports. They were a masterclass in propaganda, written in clear, elegant Latin, destined to be read in the forum back home. Gallia est omnis divisa in partes tres. Gaul is a whole divided into 3 parts. With these words, he simplified a complex tapestry of tribes, the Belgi T. The war was not a single continuous battle, but a series of violent eruptions punctuated by long periods of strategic maneuvering. It was a clash of cultures. The Gauls were warriors of immense individual bravery, men who fought with long slashing swords and painted their bodies for battle, driven by personal glory and the songs of their bards. They charged with a terrifying noise, a wall of sound designed to break the enemy's spirit. Against this, Caesar pitted the Roman machine, silent, synchronized, and lethal. The legions fought as a single organism, shields locked, stabbing with short, efficient motions. It was the triumph of the collective over the individual, of engineering over emotion. One of the most defining moments of this campaign was not a battle, but a construction project. To demonstrate that Roman power knew no boundaries, not even those set by nature, Caesar decided to cross the Rhine. The river was wide, fast, and treacherous, a natural barrier that the Germanic tribes on the other side believed to be impassable. They felt safe mocking the Romans from the eastern bank. Caesar did not search for a ford or ferry his men across in boats. He decided to build a bridge. In just 10 days, his engineers drove massive timber piles into the riverbed, bracing them against the rushing current, laying beams and planks with a speed that seemed supernatural. A bridge 1,800 feet long materialized out of nothing. The legions marched across, their armor gleaming, into the dark forests of Germania. They stayed for 18 days, burning villages and displaying their might, and then, with equal disdain, they marched back and dismantled the bridge. The message was clear and terrifying. There was nowhere the Roman eagle could not fly. The psychological impact was devastating. The tribes understood that they were fighting not just a man, but a force that could bend the very earth to its will. As the years ground on, the resistance of Gaul hardened. The tribes, realizing that their disunity was their doom, found a leader in Vercingetorix. He was a young chieftain of the Arverni, noble, charismatic, and desperate. He understood that he could not defeat Caesar in open battle, so he adopted a scorched earth policy, burning his own people's crops and villages to starve the Romans out. It was a brutal, tragic strategy that culminated in the siege of Alesia. Alesia was a hilltop fortress, a natural citadel where Vercingetorix and 80,000 of his warriors took their final stand. Caesar did not attack the walls. Instead, he unleashed the ultimate Roman weapon, the shovel. He ordered his men to build a wall around the entire mountain, a circumvallation line 10 miles long. He trapped the trappers. But then, word came that a massive Gallic relief army, numbering perhaps 250,000 men, was marching to save Vercingetorix. Caesar was now the meat in a deadly sandwich, besieged from the inside and threatened from the outside. Most generals would have retreated. Caesar ordered a second wall to be built, this one facing outward. He created a donut of fortifications, a ring of steel and earth. The Romans lived in the space between the walls, fighting two wars simultaneously. For weeks, the air was filled with the smoke of campfires and the stench of death. The Gauls threw themselves against the Roman fortifications, wave after human wave crashing against the spike-filled pits, the watchtowers, and the discipline of the legions. Caesar, wearing his scarlet cloak so his men could see him, was everywhere, rallying faltering lines, sending reserves to critical points, his presence acting as a talisman against panic. The end came in a moment of quiet solemnity that contrasted sharply with the years of bloodshed. The relief army was shattered, their morale broken by the impregnable Roman lines. Inside Alesia, starvation had done its work. The cries of the dying had faded into a terrible silence. Vercingetorix, knowing the game was lost, chose to spare his remaining people the final horror of a sack. He rode out of the gates alone. He was a magnificent figure, clad in his finest armor, his horse groomed to perfection. He rode down the hill, through the silent ranks of the watching legions, and circled the dais where Caesar sat on his camp chair. The young king dismounted, stripped off his armor, and sat at Caesar's feet, silent and motionless. He did not beg. He simply accepted the weight of history. Caesar looked down at the man who had almost broken him, his face unreadable. There was no handshake, no words of comfort. Vercingetorix was taken away in chains, destined for a Roman dungeon and a ritual execution years later. With the fall of Alesia, the fire of Gallic independence was extinguished. 1,000,000 Gauls were dead, another 1,000,000 enslaved. The vast forests and rich valleys were now property of the Republic. Caesar had done the impossible. He had added a territory twice the size of Italy to the empire. But as he looked out over the smoldering ruins of the final battle, he knew that his greatest war was not behind him, but ahead. He had conquered Gaul, but in doing so, he had become too big for Rome. The Senate feared him. Pompey, his old ally, had turned against him. The Rubicon River waited in the south, a thin stream of water that marked the line between the law and treason. The conqueror of the north turned his gaze southward, and the legions, loyal now only to him, turned with him. The die was yet to be cast, but the hand was already shaking it. The year was 49 BCE, and the Roman Republic stood upon a knife edge. The air in the capital was thick with paranoia and political maneuvering, a toxic fog that drifted north from the Forum to where Caesar waited in the province of Cisalpine Gaul. The Senate, manipulated by the Optimate faction and backed by the military reputation of Pompey the Great, had issued its ultimatum. Caesar must disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen. It was a command that carried the weight of law, but to Caesar it sounded like a death sentence. To return without his army was to walk naked into a pit of vipers. He would be prosecuted for his actions in Gaul, stripped of his dignity, and likely exiled or executed. The conqueror of the north was being backed into a corner, and the Senate had forgotten that a cornered wolf does not cower. It bites. Between Caesar and his enemies lay a geographical boundary that was insignificant in size but monumental in meaning. The Rubicon was a small, shallow river, swollen slightly by the winter rains and melting snows of the Apennines. Its waters were dark and muddy, winding through the flatlands of the Emilia-Romagna region before emptying into the Adriatic Sea. Physically, it was hardly an obstacle. A man could wade across it without getting his tunic wet above the knees. Legally and spiritually, however, it was a wall of iron reaching up to the heavens. It marked the sacred boundary of Italy proper. By ancient law, no Roman general was permitted to lead armed troops across this border. To do so was to declare war on the state itself, an act of supreme treason, nefas, a crime against gods and men. Caesar was currently stationed at Ravenna, a marshy city near the coast, with only a single legion at his immediate disposal, the 13th, Legio XIII Gemina, 5,000 men against the might of the Republic. But these were not ordinary men. They were veterans of the Gallic campaigns, soldiers whose loyalty had been forged in the fires of Alesia and the forests of Germania. They were harder than the iron of their armor, and their devotion to their general was absolute. They did not fight for the abstract concept of the Senate. They fought for Caesar. The days leading up to the crossing were filled with a strange, deceptive calm. Caesar maintained the routine of a governor. He inspected the plans for a new gladiatorial school. He attended banquets, and he conversed politely with guests, his face a mask of patrician composure. Yet, beneath this veneer, his mind was racing, calculating odds that no actuary could quantify. Couriers arrived with breathless urgency, bringing news that his allies in Rome, Mark Antony and Quintus Cassius, had been threatened with violence in the Senate house and had fled the city disguised as slaves, hiding in the back of a wagon. The diplomatic bridges had been burned. The time for negotiation was turning to ash. On the evening of January 10th, Caesar dined with friends. The conversation was light, the wine flowed, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long winter shadows across the room, Caesar excused himself. He told his guests he would return shortly, but instead, he slipped away into the deepening twilight. A carriage pulled by mules was waiting. With a small escort of officers and a few attendants, he rode south through the darkness. The air was biting cold, the damp chill of the marshes clinging to their cloaks. The sound of the mule hooves on the road was the only disruption to the silence of the countryside. They lost their way in the dark for a time, wandering down narrow tracks until a local peasant guided them back to the riverbank. There, standing in the gloom, the small stream gurgled softly against the reeds. The Rubicon, the 13th Legion, was already there, the men standing in silent ranks, their breath misting in the cold air. There were no torches, no trumpet blasts. The gravity of the moment demanded secrecy and silence. Caesar dismounted and walked to the edge of the water. He stood alone, staring into the black current. This was the moment of hesitation that history would obsess over for millennia. The Roman historian Suetonius tells us he paused for a long time. It was not fear that held him back, but the immense weight of the future. He turned to his officers, his voice low, almost a whisper in the wind. He spoke of the catastrophe that would follow if they crossed. The civil war, the blood of citizens spilled by citizens, the potential ruin of the Republic. But then he spoke of the ruin that would befall him personally if they did not. "If I hold back," he mused, looking at the dark water, "I am destroyed. If I cross, the whole world is destroyed." It was a choice between self-preservation and the established order. In the mind of Gaius Julius Caesar, the choice had arguably been made years ago, perhaps when he first looked into the mirror and saw a man destined for greatness. The hesitation was merely the final acknowledgement of the tragedy to come. He was a man of action, and the pause could not last forever. According to legend, a figure of supernatural size and beauty appeared, playing a reed pipe, and then snatched a trumpet from a soldier to blow a blast that shattered the night. But in the reality of that cold night, The signal came from Caesar's own will. He stiffened, the doubt vanishing from his eyes to be replaced by the cold steel of resolve. The famous phrase formed in his mind, a quote from the Greek playwright Menander, Alia iacta est, the die is cast. It was a gambler's phrase, an acknowledgement that the outcome was now out of his hands and in the lap of the gods. He stepped onto the wooden bridge that spanned the stream. The sound of his boots on the timber was the first note of the war. He walked across, his red cloak dull in the moonlight. Behind him, the centurions barked hushed orders, and the machine of the 13th Legion lurched into motion. 5,000 men, horses, and baggage trains began to flow across the bridge like a river of steel. There was no cheering, no battle cry, just the rhythmic, terrifying sound of disciplined marching and the clatter of equipment. They were crossing a line from which there was no return. Once on the southern bank, on Italian soil, Caesar was no longer a proconsul. He was an enemy of the state. He mounted his horse and rode hard for the town of Rimini, the first settlement on the road to Rome. The town was taken before dawn, its gates opened to the surprise of the inhabitants who woke up to find the forum filled with legionaries. The news of the crossing traveled faster than the legions. It swept down the Via Flaminia like a wildfire. Caesar is coming. The phrase struck terror into the hearts of the senators in Rome. The psychological impact was devastating. Pompey the Great, the man who was supposed to defend the Republic, was caught unprepared. He had boasted that he only needed to stamp his foot on the ground of Italy and legions would spring up to support him. Now, as Caesar advanced with a speed that defied logic, Pompey found the ground barren. Panic seized the capital. Senators who had been so bellicose in their speeches now packed their belongings in a frenzy, fleeing the city in a chaotic exodus, clogging the roads to the south. They left behind their gold, their dignity, and even the public treasury in the Temple of Saturn. Caesar did not sack the towns he captured. He did not execute his enemies. He practiced clementia, mercy. He recruited the garrisons sent to stop him, turning enemies into soldiers for his own cause. He marched south not as a destroyer, but as a man reclaiming his rights. The march was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. He presented himself as the victim of a corrupt Senate, a man forced to defend his honor. But the Rubicon remained the symbol. It was the point of no return, the threshold where the Republic effectively ended and the Empire began, though no one would admit it yet. As Caesar rode deeper into Italy, the winter landscape flying past him, he knew that the die was indeed cast. The game had begun, and he intended to play it until he was the only player left standing. The river flowed on behind him, indifferent to history, its dark waters washing away the footprints of the legion that had just walked into immortality. The chase led south, away from the familiar temperate winds of Europe, across the wine-dark Mediterranean, towards a land where the sun beat down with the weight of a hammer and the air tasted of ancient dust and lotus flowers. Julius Caesar was pursuing Pompey the Great. The civil war had effectively been decided on the dusty plains of Pharsalus in Greece, where Caesar's starving, ragged veterans had shattered the glittering legions of the Republic. Pompey, the broken titan, had fled to the one place he believed still held loyalty to his name, Egypt. And so, Caesar followed, his galleys cutting through the turquoise waters, arriving at the great harbor of Alexandria in October of 48 BCE. Alexandria was not like Rome. If Rome was a city of brick and iron, built on the sweat of conquest, Alexandria was a city of marble and pearl, built on the light of the intellect. It was the jewel of the Mediterranean, founded by Alexander himself, a grid of wide, limestone-paved boulevards that gleamed blindingly under the African sun. Dominating the harbor was the Pharos, the great lighthouse, a wonder of the world that scraped the sky, its mirror reflecting a beam of fire that guided ships from miles away. But as Caesar's ship glided into the royal harbor, under the shadow of the palaces of the Ptolemies, the atmosphere was not one of wonder, but of suffocating dread. The boy king Ptolemy XIII and his advisors waited on the shore. They offered Caesar a gift, a token of their allegiance in this Roman feud. It was a jar. Inside, pickled in brine, was the severed head of Pompey the Great. Caesar turned away in horror and wept. This was not the end he had wanted for his former friend and son-in-law. Pompey was a Roman, a consul, a man of immense dignity. To be butchered by foreign eunuchs on a foreign shore was an insult not just to Pompey, but to Rome itself. Caesar refused to look at the gruesome trophy and ordered it to be buried with full honors. He marched into the city, the fasces, the symbols of his authority, carried before him. He took up residence in the royal palace complex, a sprawling labyrinth of columned halls, hanging gardens, and mosaic floors. He acted not as a guest, but as a master, demanding the repayment of old debts owed by the Egyptian crown to Rome. The city, volatile and proud, simmered with resentment. Riots broke out in the streets. Caesar, with only a few thousand men, was effectively trapped in the palace, surrounded by a hostile army and a populace that hated him. In this atmosphere of siege and intrigue, the chessboard shifted. The boy king Ptolemy was only one half of the power struggle. His sister and wife, Cleopatra VII, had been exiled to the desert, raising an army of mercenaries to reclaim her throne. She knew that the Roman general in the palace was the key to her restoration. But how to reach him? The palace was blockaded by her brother's soldiers. Every entrance was watched, every face scrutinized. She needed a Trojan horse, a way to bypass the guards not with force, but with guile. The sun was setting over the harbor, painting the white walls of Alexandria in shades of violet and bruised orange, when a small boat slipped quietly to the palace seawall. A single Sicilian merchant stepped out, carrying a heavy roll of bedding or perhaps a carpet on his shoulder. He walked past the guards, claiming he brought a gift for the Roman consul. He was ushered into Caesar's private chambers, a room cool with the breeze from the sea, scented with citrus and frankincense. The merchant lowered the heavy bundle to the floor and untied the cords. The fabric unrolled, and from within, the Queen of Egypt emerged. She was 21 years old. She was not, perhaps, the flawless beauty of later myth, but she possessed a charm that was irresistible and a voice that was like a many-stringed instrument, capable of shifting from command to seduction in a breath. She spoke Greek, the language of Caesar's education, and she spoke it with the wit and sharpness of a scholar. She was the last of the Ptolemies, a descendant of one of Alexander's generals, and she carried herself with the weight of 300 years of divine rule. Caesar, 52 years old, a man who had conquered Gaul and bedded queens, was captivated. It was not merely lust. It was a meeting of minds. In her, he saw a reflection of his own ambition, a ruler who understood the ruthless calculus of power. That night, an alliance was forged that would shake the foundations of the world. By the next morning, when he presented her to her shocked brother, it was clear that Caesar had chosen his side. The result was war. The Alexandrian War was a desperate, claustrophobic conflict fought in the streets and canals of the great city. Caesar was outnumbered 5-1. He barricaded himself in the palace quarter, burning the Egyptian fleet in the harbor to prevent it from being used against him. The fire, fanned by the sea wind, leapt from the ships to the docks and, tragically, to the warehouses that held scrolls from the great library. The smoke of burning wisdom drifted over the city, a dark omen of the destruction to come. For months, they fought house to house, utilizing the complex architecture of the city. Caesar swam for his life when a skirmish on the Pharos Causeway went wrong, holding his journals above the water with one hand while he paddled with the other. It was a war of survival fought with the queen at his side. Eventually, reinforcements arrived from the east. The boy king's army was crushed in the Nile Delta, and Ptolemy himself drowned in the river, his gold armor weighing him down into the silt. Cleopatra was now the undisputed mistress of Egypt, with Caesar's sword as her scepter. With the war won, duty called Caesar back to Rome. The Republic was still unstable. The remnants of Pompey's faction were gathering in Africa and Spain, and the city was leaderless. Yet he stayed. For months he lingered in Egypt. He embarked on a journey that was unlike anything a Roman had ever experienced. He and Cleopatra boarded the Thalamigos, the royal barge. It was a floating palace, a behemoth of cedar and gold, 2 stories high, with dining halls, shrines, and sleeping quarters draped in purple silk. They sailed south, up the Nile, against the current. This was a journey into the deep time of the pharaohs. They passed the pyramids of Giza, ancient mountains of stone that had stood for 2,000 years before Rome was even a village of mud huts. They saw the great temples of Karnak and Luxor, forests of stone columns painted in vibrant reds and blues, covered in hieroglyphs that spoke of gods and eternity. The landscape was a ribbon of impossible green life cutting through the stark, golden death of the desert. Ibises waded in the shallows, crocodiles sunned themselves on the mud banks like living statues, and the felucca sails drifted by like white wings. For Caesar, this cruise was an intoxication. He had spent his life in the austere, masculine world of Roman politics and the grim, muddy camps of Gaul. Here, he was introduced to the concept of the God King. He saw how Cleopatra was worshipped not just as a ruler, but as the living incarnation of Isis. The people knelt in the dust as the barge passed, offering incense and prayers. He saw the absolute power of the pharaohs, unmediated by a senate or a constitution. It was a seductive vision. It whispered to the part of him that had crossed the Rubicon, the part that believed he was chosen by Venus. On the deck of the Thalamigos, under the canopy of stars that looked different here in the south, the idea of an empire, a rule of one man, semi-divine and absolute, began to crystallize in his mind. But the dream could not last. The realities of the world pulled at him. His legions, encamped in the heat, were growing restless. Rome was whispering that their general had been bewitched by a foreign sorceress. He had to leave. He left Cleopatra pregnant with his son, whom the Alexandrians would call Caesarion, Little Caesar. He left 3 legions to protect her, a guarantee of his power. As he sailed away from the lighthouse and the White City, he was leaving behind the only true holiday of his life. He was returning to the cold, hard business of being Caesar, but he carried the warmth of Egypt and the vision of kingship in his blood, a contagion that would eventually lead him to the Ides of March. The interlude was over. The tragedy was resuming its course. The dream of the Nile faded into the stern reality of the camp. Caesar left Alexandria not as a lover, but as a general who had lingered too long. The world had not paused while he floated on the royal barge. It had festered. The enemies of the new order, emboldened by his silence, were rising like weeds in a neglected garden. The Republic was dead, but its ghosts were refusing to lie down. From the east, Pharnaces II, the king of Pontus and son of Rome's old enemy Mithridates, saw the civil war as an opportunity to reclaim his father's lost empire. He swept through Anatolia, butchering Roman citizens and defying the legions. It was a direct insult, a challenge that demanded an immediate answer. Caesar moved with a speed that defied the logistics of the ancient world. He marched his legions through Syria and into the rugged highlands of modern-day Turkey. He did not stop for rest or parley. When he arrived at Zela, the air was thick with the dust of the march and the tension of imminent violence. Pharnaces, arrogant and misjudging the tired Roman troops, launched a surprise attack uphill. It was a tactical blunder against a master of the battlefield. The clash was brief, brutal, and decisive. In a mere 4 hours, the Pontic army was annihilated, scattered like chaff before the wind. It was not a war. It was a correction. To announce this victory to the Senate in Rome, Caesar did not write a long, flowery dispatch detailing his maneuvers. He wrote 3 words, 3 Latin words that possessed the percussive rhythm of a sword striking a shield. Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. The brevity was the message. It told the aristocracy back home that their petty disputes and long debates were irrelevant. It told them that Caesar's will was instant and irresistible. The phrase traveled across the sea, echoing in the marble halls of the capital, striking fear into the hearts of those who still hoped to oppose him. But the Hydra had many heads. While the East was pacified, the remnants of the Optimate faction had gathered in North Africa. Scipio and Cato the Younger, the moral compass of the old republic, had assembled a massive army, bolstered by the 60 war elephants of King Juba of Numidia. Caesar sailed to Africa. The campaign that followed was a grueling test of endurance in the arid heat. It culminated in the Battle of Thapsus. Here, the legions, perhaps tired of the endless wars, fought with a savage fury that even Caesar could not fully control. They slaughtered the enemy elephants, the great beasts trumpeting in pain as they turned on their own lines. The Optimate army collapsed. Cato the Younger, besieged in the city of Utica, realized that the dream of a free republic was finally over. Unwilling to live in a world ruled by Caesar's mercy, he chose to end his own life by falling on his sword. When Caesar heard the news, he did not rejoice. He looked out over the African sea, his face clouded with a mixture of respect and frustration. "Cato," he murmured, "I grudge you your death, as you would have grudged me the preservation of your life." He had wanted to pardon Cato, to show the world that his new order was built on forgiveness, but Cato had denied him that final moral victory. There remained one last ember of resistance. The sons of Pompey had raised an army in Spain. Caesar traveled to the Iberian Peninsula for the final act of the civil war. The Battle of Munda was the most desperate of his career. It was a chaotic, muddy brawl where strategy broke down into sheer survival. At one point, seeing his lines waver, Caesar snatched a shield from a soldier and ran to the front line, shouting to his men, asking if they were going to let their general be captured by boys. Shamed by his courage, the 10th Legion rallied. They pushed back. The slaughter was immense, but when the sun set over the Spanish hills, Caesar was the last man standing. He later told his friends that he had often fought for victory, but at Munda he had fought for his life. With the world now pacified, Caesar returned to Rome to celebrate. And what a celebration it was! He staged not one, but 4 consecutive triumphs, a month-long festival of power that stunned the city. Each triumph was dedicated to a different victory: Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa. The streets of Rome were scrubbed clean and strewn with flowers. The air was heavy with the scent of saffron and burning incense. The roar of the crowd was a physical force, a wall of sound that shook the tiles on the roofs. First came the triumph for Gaul. Wagons creaked under the weight of gold and silver, the spoils of the northern tribes. Paintings and models depicted the Rhine, the white cliffs of Dover, and the siege of Alesia. The ultimate prize, Vercingetorix, who had languished in a dungeon for 6 years, was paraded in chains before being led away to his execution. A grim reminder of the price of defying Rome. Next was the Egyptian triumph. It was a spectacle of exotic wonder. The parade featured giraffes, creatures the Romans had never seen before, and statues of the Nile gods. But conspicuously absent was Cleopatra. Instead, an effigy of her sister Arsinoe was displayed in chains. The crowd gasped at the wealth of the Ptolemies, the pearls and the gold that flowed like water. Then came the Pontic triumph. In the procession, a simple placard was carried high on a pole. It bore no image of a king or a battle, just the 3 words, Veni Vidi Vici. The crowd went wild, chanting the phrase until it became the heartbeat of the city. Finally, the African triumph. This was delicate, for it celebrated a victory over fellow Romans. To avoid offending the people, Caesar focused the parade on the defeat of King Juba. 40 elephants marched in the procession, carrying torches in their trunks that lit up the evening sky like moving stars. At the climax of these processions rode Caesar himself. He stood in a chariot drawn by 4 white horses. He wore the toga picta, dyed entirely in royal purple and embroidered with gold palm leaves. His face was painted red with vermilion, impersonating Jupiter, the king of the gods. A slave stood behind him in the chariot, holding a golden laurel wreath over his head, whispering continuously in his ear, "Memento mori, remember, you are mortal." It was a ritual check on hubris, but as Caesar looked out at the sea of faces, at the soldiers singing ribald songs about his baldness and his love affairs, at the senators bowing their heads, it must have been hard to believe he was still just a man. He lavished money on the people. Every citizen received a gift of grain, oil, and 75 denarii, a small fortune. He hosted a public banquet for the entire male population of Rome, 22,000 tables set up in the streets, laden with wine and meat. The city was drunk on Caesar's glory. He was no longer just a consul or a general. He was the pater patri, the father of the fatherland. He was appointed dictator for 10 years. Rome had changed. The chaotic, bickering republic of his youth was gone, replaced by an order that radiated from a single will. He began to reshape the city in stone. He planned a new forum, a new theater, a new library. He reformed the calendar, aligning the Roman year with the solar cycle, creating the Julian calendar that would govern time for the next 16 centuries. He was building a legacy meant to last forever. Yet, amidst the cheering crowds and the golden statues, the shadows were lengthening. The senators, stripped of their power but left with their pride, watched him with eyes that had turned cold. They saw a king in all but name. They saw a man who wore red boots, who sat on a golden chair in the Senate, who allowed his statue to be placed among the gods. The sleep of the Republic was ending, but a nightmare was beginning to stir in the hearts of men like Brutus and Cassius. Caesar, the master of the world, was about to learn that the only thing more dangerous than a war is the peace that follows it. The swords were finally sheathed. The dust of the battlefields in Pharsalus, Thapsus, and Munda had settled, leaving a silence that stretched from the Pillars of Hercules to the sands of Syria. For the first time in decades, the gates of the Temple of Janus, open only in times of war, were closed. Rome was at peace, but it was a peace dictated by the will of a single man. Gaius Julius Caesar sat at the center of the world, not merely as a consul or a general, but as an entity that defied the ancient definitions of the Republic. He was 56 years old, his body worn by the saddle and the camp bed, his face deeply lined, his hair thinning to reveal the dome of his skull. Yet, his mind was sharper, faster, and more restless than it had ever been. He did not rest on his laurels. He treated the governance of the empire with the same ferocious intensity he had applied to the conquest of Gaul. He knew that winning the war was the easy part. Ruling the peace was the task of titans. He began to reshape the very fabric of Roman life, treating the state as a sculptor treats a block of rough marble. His first and most enduring enemy was not a man, but time itself. The Roman calendar, a messy lunar system managed by priests who often forgot to add the necessary leap months, was hopelessly out of sync with the seasons. Harvest festivals were falling in winter. Soldiers were marching in the wrong weather. It was a symbol of the chaos he had come to fix. Drawing on the knowledge he had gleaned from the astronomers of Alexandria during his nights with Cleopatra, Caesar summoned the mathematician Sosigenes. Together, they aligned the Roman year with the solar cycle, establishing a year of 365 days with a leap year every fourth year. It was an act of supreme rationalism. With the stroke of a pen, he commanded time, ordering the year 46 BCE to be extended to 445 days, the year of confusion, to reset the clock. The citizens grumbled, but the sun and the stars obeyed. He gave his name to the month of his birth, Quintilis, which became July. He was writing himself into the rhythm of the cosmos. His energy was terrifying. He looked at the snarled, chaotic streets of Rome and saw inefficiency. He banned wheeled traffic from the city center during the day to ease congestion, creating the world's first pedestrian zones. He planned a massive library to rival Alexandria's, appointing the scholar Varro to collect the knowledge of the world. He ordered the draining of the Pontine marshes to create more farmland and to banish the malaria that plagued the Italian coast. He looked at the ruins of Carthage and Corinth, two great cities destroyed by Roman wrath a century earlier, and ordered them to be rebuilt. Where others saw graves, Caesar saw potential. He settled his veterans not by confiscating land from the innocent in Italy, but by sending them to these new colonies, spreading Roman culture and relieving the overcrowding of the capital. But as his reforms flowed like a river, washing away the debris of the old aristocracy, his power grew more absolute and more ostentatious. The Senate, once the supreme council of kings, had been reduced to an assembly of sycophants. They heaped honors upon him, partly out of fear, partly out of a calculated desire to make him look ridiculous, to push him towards hubris. They voted him the title Pater Patri, Father of the Fatherland. They renamed the month of Quintilis to Julius. They allowed him to wear the triumphal dress, the purple robe and the laurel wreath on all public occasions. Caesar, perhaps blinded by his own brilliance or perhaps simply indifferent to the opinions of lesser men, accepted it all. He began to separate himself from the rest of humanity. In the Senate House, he did not sit on a standard curule chair. He sat on a throne of ivory and gold. When the senators entered, he did not rise to greet them, a breach of etiquette that sent shockwaves through the aristocracy. He was elevated, physically and metaphorically. His statue was placed in the Temple of Quirinus with the inscription, "To the Invincible God." Another statue was carried in the procession of the gods at the circus. He was walking the dangerous line between man and divinity, a line that the Romans, with their deep hatred of kings, held sacred. The tension in the city was palpable. It was a heavy, humid atmosphere, like the air before a summer storm. The old families, the liberatores, men like Cassius Longinus, a lean and hungry-looking man with a sharp mind and a bitter heart, and Marcus Brutus, the brooding intellectual whom Caesar loved like a son, watched with growing horror. They saw the Republic not as a broken system that needed fixing, but as a sacred heritage being strangled by a tyrant. They whispered in the shadows of the porticos. They passed notes. They met in secret, away from the prying eyes of Caesar's spies. They did not see a reformer. They saw a king. And for a Roman, the word rex, king, was a curse, a memory of the ancient tyranny they had overthrown 5 centuries ago. The breaking point of public perception came in February of 44 BCE at the festival of Lupercalia. It was a wild, ancient festival of purification and fertility. Caesar sat on his golden chair in the forum, watching the runners. Mark Antony, his loyal lieutenant, flushed with exertion and perhaps wine, broke from the crowd. He climbed up to Caesar and offered him a diadem, a white ribbon that was the ancient symbol of Hellenistic kingship. The crowd fell into a dead silence. It was a test, a theater piece. Caesar refused the crown, pushing it away. "I am not king, I am Caesar," he proclaimed. The crowd roared with approval. Antony offered it again. Again Caesar refused. He ordered the diadem to be taken to the temple of Jupiter, stating that Jupiter was the only king of the Romans. But the damage was done. The people wondered, was it a staged refusal? Did he secretly desire the crown? The seed of doubt had been planted, and his enemies watered it with fear. Shortly after, the Senate voted him the ultimate title, Dictator Perpetuo, Dictator for Life. This was the final nail in the coffin of the Republic. Dictatorship was supposed to be a temporary measure, a 6-month emergency power. By making it permanent, Caesar had effectively declared that the emergency would never end. He had declared that the Republic would never return. He was the state. Yet, amidst this accumulation of power, Caesar was strangely vulnerable. He dismissed his personal bodyguard of Spanish soldiers, saying that it was better to die once than to live constantly in fear of death. He walked the streets with only his lictors and his friends. He was accessible, reading petitions, settling disputes, acting with the confidence of a man who believed his dignitas was a shield. He was planning a new war, a massive campaign against the Parthian Empire to the east, to avenge the death of Crassus and recover the lost Roman eagles. He was due to leave on March 18th. The conspirators knew they had a deadline. If Caesar left for Parthia, he would return even more powerful, untouchable. They had to act before he departed. The date was set, the Ides of March, the 15th. A meeting of the Senate was scheduled to take place in the Theater of Pompey, as the Senate House was being rebuilt. In the days leading up to the Ides, the omens were dark. It is said that horses Caesar had dedicated to the gods at the Rubicon refused to eat and wept. A wren, carrying a sprig of laurel, was torn apart by other birds in the Senate House. Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, plagued by nightmares of holding his murdered body, begged him not to go to the Senate on the 15th. The Spurina, a soothsayer, had warned him, "Beware the Ides of March." Caesar, the rationalist, the man who had realigned the stars and conquered nations, scoffed at these superstitions. He was tired, perhaps, tired of his body failing him. He suffered from dizzy spells and perhaps epilepsy, tired of the endless pettiness of politics. On the evening of March 14th, at a dinner party, the conversation turned to what was the best sort of death. Caesar, looking up from his correspondence, answered instantly, "A sudden and unexpected one." As the sun rose on the 15th of March, the sky over Rome was a pale, watery blue. Caesar felt unwell. He almost stayed home. But Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators and a man Caesar trusted implicitly, came to the house. He mocked the idea of staying home because of a woman's bad dreams. "The Senate is waiting," he urged. "They are ready to vote you the title of king for the provinces. Will you keep them waiting?" Caesar's pride was the lever they used to move him. He put on his toga, the heavy purple-bordered fabric draping over his shoulder. He stepped out into the morning light. The city was waking up, the carts rumbling, the noise of the Subura rising. He walked towards the Theater of Pompey, towards the statue of his old enemy, towards the men who smiled at him while gripping daggers beneath their robes. He was walking into history, not as a god, but as a man about to learn the ultimate price of absolute power. The dictator for life had only hours left to live. The morning of March 15th, 44 BCE, dawned with a deceptive normalcy. The sky over Rome was a pale, washed-out blue, with thin clouds streaking across the horizon like brushstrokes of lead paint. Below, the great city was a beast shaking off sleep. The rumble of wooden-wheeled carts on basalt paving stones, the cries of street vendors hawking hot sausages and watered wine, the smell of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the faint, metallic tang of the Tiber River filled the air. It was a day like any other, yet it was a day that would crack the spine of history. In the Domus Publica, the official residence of the Pontifex Maximus in the Forum, Gaius Julius Caesar awoke from a restless sleep. The air in his chamber felt heavy, suffocating. His wife, Calpurnia, had cried out in the night, her dreams haunted by visions of a collapsing pediment on their house and her husband dying in her arms. The atmosphere was thick with unvoiced dread, tension that seemed to seep from the very walls of the ancient city. Caesar himself was unwell. The dizziness that plagued him, the falling sickness, was hovering at the edges of his consciousness. He contemplated staying home, sending Mark Antony to dismiss the Senate. It would have been easy. He was the dictator. His will was law. But fate, in the form of Decimus Brutus, intervened. Decimus, a trusted general who had fought beside Caesar in Gaul, a man named as a secondary heir in Caesar's will, was one of the chief conspirators. He arrived at the house, his face a mask of loyal concern. With practiced words, he gently mocked the idea of the master of the world being cowed by a woman's nightmares. He appealed to Caesar's pride, to his sense of duty, to the insult it would offer the senators who were waiting to bestow new honors upon him. Caesar, persuaded by the serpent he harbored in his bosom, ordered his lictors to prepare. He put on his toga, the heavy purple-bordered garment. That was the uniform of his power. He stepped out into the daylight, a man walking towards his own altar. The journey from the Forum to the Theater of Pompey, where the Senate was meeting while the Curia was being rebuilt, was a slow procession through a dense throng of admirers, petitioners, and the simply curious. The noise was deafening. People pressed in on all sides, hoping to touch his robe, to hand him a scroll to catch his eye. In this chaotic crush, a Greek teacher of logic named Artemidorus managed to push his way to the front. He held a scroll that contained a detailed list of the conspirators and their plan. He thrust it into Caesar's hand, urging him to read it immediately, saying it concerned weighty matters. Caesar took the scroll, but the press of the crowd was too great. He handed it to a slave, intending to read it later. The warning, the salvation, passed through his fingers and was lost in the noise of the moment. Further along the route, he spotted the soothsayer Spurina, the man who had warned him to beware the Ides of March. Caesar, perhaps with a touch of arrogant bravado, called out to him over the heads of his lictors, "The Ides of March have come." Spurina looked at the most powerful man on earth with sad, knowing eyes and replied softly, "I, Caesar, but they are not gone." They arrived at the complex of Pompey. The Senate meeting was to be held in a large rectangular hall, the Curia Pompeiana, attached to the massive stone theater. Inside, hundreds of senators in gleaming white togas were already gathered, a sea of murmuring voices that fell silent as the dictator entered. The air was cooler here, smelling of cold marble and old incense. At the far end of the hall stood a large statue of Pompey the Great, Caesar's defeated rival, looking down on the proceedings with stony indifference. As Caesar walked toward his gilded chair, the plan went into motion. Mark Antony, whose strength and loyalty were feared by the conspirators, was intercepted at the door by Trebonius, who engaged him in a lengthy, distracting conversation. Inside, the conspirators, about 60 men in total, began to cluster around Caesar's chair. They were men he knew, men he had pardoned, men he had promoted. At their head were Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius. Brutus, the intellectual, the stoic, the man whose mother had been Caesar's lover, the man Caesar loved like a son. Cassius, lean and hungry, the driving force of the plot, whose hatred was a cold, hard thing. They approached him under the pretense of a petition. Tullius Cimber grabbed Caesar's toga, pulling it down from his shoulder, the prearranged signal. Caesar, annoyed by this breach of decorum, cried out, "Why? This is violence." Then the first blow fell. Servilius Casca, standing behind Caesar, struck him in the neck with a dagger. It was a clumsy, nervous blow, more shocking than lethal. Caesar, his soldier's instincts kicking in, grabbed Casca's arm and spun around, roaring, "Vile Casca, what are you doing?" He snatched up his stylus, a sharp metal writing instrument, and stabbed Casca in the arm. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the old lion might fight his way out. But then the dam broke. The other conspirators rushed in, a frenzy of flashing steel and hatred. They were countless, closing in on him like a pack of wolves. They stabbed him in the chest, the face, the groin. The air was filled with the grunts of men exerting themselves, the tearing of fabric, and the sickening wet sound of blades entering flesh. Caesar fought back wildly, twisting and turning, trying to shield himself, his blood spraying onto the white togas of his attackers. He was driven back, step by bloody step, towards the pedestal of Pompey's statue. His eyes, wide with the shock of betrayal, darted from face to face, seeing only murder in the eyes of men he had called friends. And then he saw him, Brutus. Brutus was pushing through the throng, his dagger drawn. Caesar stopped fighting. The will to resist evaporated, replaced by an overwhelming, crushing heartbreak. He looked at the young man and whispered the words that have echoed through the centuries. Not the Latinity tu, brute, of Shakespeare, but the Greek that Suetonius recorded, more intimate and devastating. Kai su teknon? You too, my child? With that, Caesar pulled the folds of his toga over his head, a final act of dignity to hide his dying face from the world. He stopped struggling. The blows continued to rain down on his shrouded form. He fell at the base of Pompey's statue, his blood splashing onto the stone plinth, as if in a final, ironic libation to his dead rival. He was stabbed 23 times. Only one wound, the second one to his chest, was fatal. The rest were the marks of a frenzy, a collective act of butchery designed to bind the conspirators together in blood guilt. When it was over, a terrible silence fell upon the hall, broken only by the heavy breathing of the assassins and the drip of blood on marble. The other senators, those not in on the plot, had watched frozen in horror. Now panic seized them. They fled the curia, rushing out into the portico and the streets, spreading the news like a contagion. "The tyrant is dead. Liberty is restored," cried the conspirators, holding up their bloody daggers and wrapping their togas around their left arms as makeshift shields. But there was no cheering in the streets, only a stunned, terrified silence, followed by the chaotic noise of shutters being barred and doors being locked. The city held its breath, waiting for the sky to fall. Caesar's body lay where it had fallen for hours, a heap of bloodied purple cloth at the feet of Pompey. The most powerful man in the world was abandoned, save for 3 of his slaves who eventually crept in. With trembling hands, they lifted their master's broken body onto a litter. As they carried him home through the emptying forum, one arm dropped from the litter and dangled limply, a stark symbol of fallen greatness. They brought him back to the Domus Publica, to Calpurnia, whose worst nightmare had become the world's reality. The sun set over Rome, casting a blood-red light over a city that had killed its father, a city teetering on the edge of an abyss, about to plunge into a chaos far worse than anything the dictator had ever imposed. The Ides of March had come, and with it, the end of an age. The knives had done their work, but the story was far from over. In the immediate aftermath of the Ides of March, Rome did not erupt into the celebration of liberty that Brutus and Cassius had imagined. Instead, a heavy, stunned silence descended upon the 7 hills. The people locked their doors. The markets were empty. The body of the dictator lay in the house of the pontifex, washed of its blood but bearing the 23 mouths that shouted of betrayal. The conspirators, realizing too late that they had killed the man but not his spirit, barricaded themselves on the Capitoline Hill, guarded by their gladiators, looking down at a city that stared back with sullen, unreadable eyes. They had removed the head of the state, but they had no plan for the body. The turning point came at the funeral. It was a day of suffocating heat and raw emotion. The pyre was built in the Forum, not far from the Regia where Caesar had lived. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant, a man of appetites and passions, seized the moment. He did not need to invent a new script. He simply held up the blood-stained toga of the fallen leader. He showed the crowd the rents in the fabric where the daggers had pierced. He read Caesar's will aloud. The mob, swaying between fear and anger, listened in disbelief. Caesar had not left the Republic to a tyrant. He had left his personal gardens across the Tiber to the people as a public park. He had bequeathed a sum of money to every single citizen of Rome. The narrative shifted instantly. The liberators were no longer heroes. They were parricides who had murdered the people's generous father. The grief of the crowd ignited into a firestorm of rage. They tore apart the wooden benches of the tribunals and the shops to feed the funeral pyre, creating a wall of flame that consumed Caesar's body and, symbolically, the Republic itself. From the ashes of that pyre, a new reality emerged. It was heralded by a sign from the heavens. In July of 44 BCE, during the games held in honor of Caesar, a massive comet appeared in the daylight sky. It blazed for 7 days, a streak of fire that the Romans interpreted not as an omen of doom, but as the soul of Julius Caesar ascending to the heavens to take his place among the gods. He was formally deified by the Senate, becoming Divus Iulius, the divine Julius. He was the first Roman in history to be worshipped as a god. The man who had walked the muddy streets of the Subura, who had shivered in the fever swamps of Spain, who had hesitated at the Rubicon, was now a star. But on earth, the struggle for his mantle was just beginning. It did not fall to Mark Antony, the seasoned soldier, but to a sickly, 18-year-old boy named Gaius Octavius. He was Caesar's grandnephew and, as revealed in the will, his adopted son and heir. The boy took the name of his father. He became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. Underestimated by everyone, mocked by his enemies as a boy who owes everything to a name, he possessed a cold, calculating political genius that even Caesar might have envied. He joined forces with Antony to hunt down the assassins. At the Battle of Philippi, the ghosts of the Ides were laid to rest. Brutus and Cassius, facing defeat, took their own lives with the very daggers they had used against Caesar. The circle of blood was closed. Yet the world was too small for two masters. The final act of the tragedy played out a decade later, again involving the Queen of Egypt. Antony, seduced by the vision of the East and the allure of Cleopatra, turned against Rome. Octavian, the champion of the West, crushed them at Actium. With their deaths, the last rivals were gone. Octavian stood alone. He returned to Rome not as a dictator, but as the princeps, the first citizen. He took the title Augustus, the revered one. He closed the doors of the Temple of Janus and ushered in the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It was a golden age of stability and prosperity that would last for 2 centuries, an empire built on the foundations laid by Julius Caesar. Caesar's legacy, however, transcended the borders of the empire he helped create. He had changed the very conception of what a ruler could be. He was the bridge between the chaotic, communal rule of the city-state and the centralized authority of the monarchy. His military campaigns in Gaul drew the map of modern Europe, bringing the French and German lands into the orbit of Mediterranean civilization. His Latin, the clear, precise language of his commentaries, became the bedrock of the Romance languages spoken by billions today. Even his name refused to die. Caesar ceased to be a family name and became a title, a synonym for supreme power. For 2,000 years, rulers would clothe themselves in his identity. The German emperors called themselves Kaiser. The Russian autocrats called themselves Tsar. From the frozen steppes of the East to the forests of the West, the echo of his name commanded obedience long after his marble statues had crumbled into dust. And then there is time itself. Every time we look at a calendar, we are living in Caesar's world. The month of July is his eternal monument. The leap year is his invention. He organized the flow of days and seasons, imposing a rational order on the chaos of the universe, a feat perhaps greater than any military conquest. As the centuries roll on, the man himself fades into the mist of legend, yet the essence remains vivid. We see him in the ambition of leaders, in the fragility of republics, in the eternal tension between freedom and security. But tonight, let us leave the politics and the wars behind. Let us remember the human moments that the history books often gloss over. Think of the young boy in the atrium of his mother's house, dreaming of glory while the rain fell into the impluvium. Think of the young man standing on the prow of a ship, looking at the white cliffs of an unknown island called Britain, wondering what lay beyond the edge of the world. Think of the scholar writing by candlelight in his tent, the sounds of the legion sleeping around him, trying to capture the truth of his life in ink. Think of the man who, at the height of his power, wished for a sudden death because he was tired of fearing it. The fires of the funeral pyre have long since burned out. The shouts of the legions have faded into the silence of the earth. The Roman Forum, once the noisy center of the world, is now a quiet ruin where wildflowers grow between the cracked stones and tourists whisper in the heat. The marble columns lie broken in the grass, dreaming of the days when they held up the sky. Julius Caesar rests now, not as a god, nor as a king, but as a part of the deep, sedimented history of our species. His story is a testament to the boundless capacity of the human spirit to shape reality, for better or for worse. As the stars will overhead in the orderly procession he helped to map, the turmoil of his life resolves into a final, peaceful stillness. The die was cast, the river was crossed, the world was changed. And now, at the end of the journey, the great noise of history settles into a gentle, rhythmic silence. A silence as deep and as wide as the sea he once sailed. A silence that invites rest. Sleep now, surrounded by the echoes of an empire that vanished, yet remains. The story is told. The scroll is rolled shut. The night has come,